I'm delighted to be here to participate in the common cause which brings us together, the struggle against hate, against racism, against anti-Semitism as a paradigm of radical hatred, indeed, in a word, against injustice. And this as part of the larger struggle for human rights and human dignity in our time. And what I'd like to do and share with you today is share some thoughts and reflections and some current concerns, and at the end even some hopes about the Jewish condition and the human condition, about assaults on Jews and assaults on human rights, about the state of Jews in the world today and the state of the world inhabited by Jews, about anti-Semitism as not only the oldest and most enduring of hatreds, but also as the most lethal, reminding me of the magisterial work of my old friend and our late and very lamented colleague Robert Wistrich, arguably the greatest scholar of anti-Semitism in the world, and I commend his book to you, his magisterial work on anti-Semitism as a lethal obsession. On the 80th anniversary of the Nuremberg race laws, which effectively were prologue and precursor to the Holocaust. On the 71st anniversary, the immediate aftermath, which was commemorated International Holocaust Remembrance Day, of the liberation of Auschwitz, the most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century, reminding us of horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. 1.3 million people were murdered at Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them were Jews. Let there be no mistake about it. Jews were murdered at Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism did not die at Auschwitz. It remains and has morphed into the bloodied canary in the global mineshaft of evil today. And as we've learned only too well and too tragically, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And so the underlying thesis of my remarks today, that we are witnessing an old, new, global, escalating, sophisticated, virulent, and even lethal anti-Semitism, grounded in classical anti-Semitism, but distinguishable from it, that received its first international juridical expression in the United Nations Zionism is Racism Resolution, whose 40th anniversary we recently commemorated, but has gone dramatically beyond that. And I recall to you the words of the late Senator Daniel Moynihan, then the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, who said of the resolution that it gave the abomination of anti-Semitism the appearance of international legal sanction. A new anti-Semitism for which we have yet to develop a set of metrics to identify it and appreciate it. And I will try to share with you some metrics that are grounded in equality law and human rights law. In a word, traditional or classical anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members of whatever society they inhabit. And social scientists have developed metrics for the identification and evaluation of this traditional anti-Semitism. And indeed, the Anti-Defamation League in 2014 conducted a global survey organized around 11 questions or metrics, things such as, do the Jews have too much power, etc. And they concluded at the end of that anti-Semitism was a persistent and pervasive virus. But I want to suggest to you that there is a new anti-Semitism for which we have yet to properly develop, identify, and assess the metrics for this a new anti-Semitism. As it happens, 15 years ago, my colleague Per Ahlmark, former Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, at the time appreciating the metrics of the old and the new said as follows, and it was a rather pithy summary of the relationship between the two, and I thought I might just read it to you, and I quote, "Observing the complex intersections between old and new anti-Semitism and the impact of the new on the old, Per Ahlmark, as I said, the Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, presciently concluded some 15 years ago as follows, quote, compared to most previous anti-Jewish outbreaks, this new anti-Semitism is often less directed against individual Jews. It primarily targets the collective Jews, the State of Israel, and then such attacks start a chain reaction of assaults on individual Jews and Jewish institutions. In the past, as he concluded, the most dangerous anti-Semites were those who wanted to make the world Judenrein, free of Jews. Today, the most dangerous anti-Semites might be those who want to make the world Judenstaatsrein, free of a Jewish state. And so what I'd like to do now is summarize for you 4 metrics of the new anti-Semitism. I've written elsewhere about them 12 metrics, but I'm going to try to share with you 4 and do so in as brief a fashion I can. This is an informed audience, and it does not need any particular elaboration. The first metric or indicator, and the most lethal manifestation of this new anti-Semitism, is what might be called genocidal anti-Semitism. This is not a term that I use easily or lightly, but I am abstracting from the Genocides Convention's prohibition of direct and public incitement with respect to speaking of this genocidal anti-Semitism. Simply put, if anti-Semitism is the most enduring of hatreds and the advocacy of genocide the most horrific of crimes, then anchoring this genocidal intent in this most lethal of hatreds is the most toxic of combinations, which led the Supreme Court of Canada some 25 years ago to say that the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words. And some 10 years ago, in a fascinating case which regrettably has not been sufficiently appreciated as principle and precedent, the Supreme Court in the Muga Serra case concluded that the very incitement to genocide constitutes the crime, whether or not acts of genocide subsequently follow. And this occurred because in 1992, a Rwandan, Leon Mugesera, came to Canada to seek to get refugee status. During the proceedings, it emerged that he had been inciting to genocide in Rwanda in the early 90s. And then came the question of his complicity in that genocide. He said, how could I be complicit? I wasn't there in 1994. I was living in Canada. I had come in 1992. I was seeking refugee status. And that's when the court concluded at the end of a set of hearings that his very incitement to genocide constituted the crime. And therefore, not only did he not secure refugee status, but in fact was deported. Let me now just give you there, again, I've written elsewhere about 8 manifestations of genocidal anti-Semitism, but I don't want to burden you. I'm just going to begin with one, and that is the state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide of Khamenei's Iran. And I use that term to distinguish it from the people and publics of Iran who are otherwise the targets of mass domestic repression. But we sometimes forget, if we ever really knew, that the 21st century began on January 3rd, 2000, with Khamenei saying that there can be no solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict without the annihilation of the Jewish state, not even the euphemism of the Zionist entity, without the annihilation of the Jewish state. The year 2000 ended with Khamenei saying that we have to excise this tumor, malignant tumor, Israel, from the Middle East. And so it has continued to the present day, where in the past week, when Iran test-fired its missiles, on the missiles it was written in Hebrew and in Arabic, "Wipe Israel off the map," which largely went again unnoticed, but a clear and standing incitement to hate and genocide, and a clear and standing breach of the prohibition against it in the Genocide Convention and the jurisprudence that has accompanied it, not only in the Supreme Court of Canada, but in the International Criminal Court for former Yugoslavia or for Rwanda and the like. And so, in a word, on this first metric, Israel and the Jewish people become the only state and the only people in the world today that are the standing targets of state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide. And I've not even gone into the other manifestations of it, be it the Hamas Charter and the like. Which brings me now to the second metric, and that's the globalizing indictment of Israel and the Jewish people as the embodiment of all evil in the world today, of Israel as a colonialist, imperialist, racist, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, genocidal Nazi state, the embodiment of the worst evils of the 20th century and constitutive of all evil in the 21st century. And so Israel and the Jewish people become not only the only state and the only people systematically the targets of state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide, but the only state and the only people systematically accused of being genocidal themselves, the whole serving as prologue and justification for the actual incitement against it or the assault upon it. And it serves as well as a validator for the third metric of anti-Semitism, political anti-Semitism, the denial, in effect, of fundamental rights to Israel and the Jewish people. In other words, if the first metric, genocidal anti-Semitism, is the public call for the destruction of Israel and the Jewish people, and the second metric is Israel and the Jewish people as the embodiment of all evil, warranting, in effect, the assaults upon it, then political anti-Semitism is the denial of Israel's right to exist, the denial of its legitimacy, the denial of its right to self-defense against acts of terror and the like. In a word, the denial of the Jewish people's right to self-determination, if not even, at some points, the denial even that the Jews are a people. As Martin Luther King put it so well and so presciently, and I just summarize that statement, quote, "It is a denial to the Jews of the same right, the right to self-determination that we accord to all African nations and to all peoples of the globe." And as he concluded, in short, it is anti-Semitism. Which brings me to the fourth manifestation of anti-Semitism, and one that ought to be of particular concern to us, and one that is particularly prejudicial and pernicious. I'm referring here to the laundering or masking of anti-Semitism under universal public values. The first three metrics that I shared with you have, at least if I can call it that, the virtue of being overt and public. This one has the sophistication about it that makes it more prejudicial and, as I said, pernicious. This is the laundering of anti-Semitism, and I'll just choose four universal values and give one example of each, again for reasons of time. But the laundering of anti-Semitism under the protective cover of the United Nations, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, under the struggle against racism. As a Canadian for whom the United Nations is part of our DNA, where international law is held out to be a centerpiece of our identity, where human rights is held out, not that we implement these things, but at least articulate it as an organizing idiom of our foreign policy. Whereas a justice minister, I had the privilege to inaugurate a national justice policy against racism and hate. This laundering of anti-Semitism under universal public values effectively is prejudicial to each of the four values themselves. Forget about the particular prejudice to Israel and the Jewish people. Let me now give you one example of each. Under the laundering of anti-Semitism under the protective cover of the UN. I'm not saying anything new to this audience when I tell you that every year the United Nations General Assembly, in its annual ritual, adopts 20 resolutions of condemnation against one member state of the international community, which happens to be Israel, and only 4 or sometimes 3 resolutions, as it was this past December, against the rest of the international community combined, thereby not only singling out one member state for differential indictment and discrimination, which would be bad enough in terms of its standing breaches of the UN Charter and the like, but giving exculpatory immunity to the major human rights violators and fostering thereby a culture of immunity and impunity at the United Nations. But what may not be realized, and I say this as somebody who was a member at different times of Canadian delegations to the United Nations, is that this process of delegitimization, which culminates in 20 resolutions at the end of December, begins in mid-September. So you have 3 months of this process of delegitimization. And exposed to this are those who are the members of these delegations, who are not only diplomats, they are parliamentarians, they are academics, they are journalists, they are representatives of civil society, they are NGO reps, they are sometimes students and the like. So not only is there a critical mass of indictment, but there is a critical mass of exposure to that indictment. And it takes place not only in the United Nations General Assembly. Every year for the last 40 years, and then when I finish, consider the cumulative effect of this kind of indictment. Every year, the United Nations specialized agencies end up with their own process of the laundering of delegitimization under universal public values. And so it is then that the International Labour Organization condemns Israel for its suppression of Palestinian trade unionism. And so Israel is therefore the enemy of labor, the enemy of health in the resolution of the World Health Organization, and this took place 41 years ago, which condemned Israel for its mass poisonings of Palestinians on the West Bank, variations of which have taken place since, and in 2015, Israel was held to be the worst violator of the rights of health of any country in the world today. Israel as the enemy of culture, evidence the resolution of UNESCO condemning alleged, I say alleged, but this is not the resolutions of passed, Israeli desecration of Palestinian historic sites in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. The enemy of women, evidence the resolution of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, condemning not only Israel as being an oppressor of women's rights, but again in 2015 as being the only oppressor of women's rights in the world today. The enemy of peace, evidence the resolutions thereto regarding Israel as a non-peace-loving nation, and finally, as the enemy of human rights. The resolutions of the United Nations Council on Human Rights and its predecessor, the UN Commission on Human Rights, and we are meeting at a very important moment because this is now the 40th anniversary of the UN Commission on Human Rights, 10th anniversary of the UN Council on Human Rights. Every single year, Israel is condemned as the worst and sometimes the only violator of human rights in the world today. So that's under that rubric. laundering under the protective cover of the United Nations. Let me just give you one example of many that could bore and burden you forever of the laundering of delegitimization under the authority of international law. In December 2014, the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention, which is considered to be the repository of international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict, convened to put one state in the international community in the docket. It was not Russia, it was not Syria, it was not Iran, it was not North Korea. I can go on. The only state put in the docket for its violations of international humanitarian law was Israel. This has happened 3 times in the last 50 years. In each instance, that state was Israel. And some of my colleagues in law schools who teach the jurisprudence of international humanitarian law go about it without at the same time contextualizing it by saying, oh, by the way, it isn't that it is Israel that is violating international humanitarian law, but those who convene these state party conferences only indict Israel for its violations of international humanitarian law. Let me take it now to laundering under the culture of human rights. The UN Council on Human Rights, some 40% of all its resolutions single out one member state for condemnation. You know who it is. Some 50% of all its special sessions or emergency resolutions setting up commissions of inquiry target Israel. With regard to Operation Protective Edge, and last June the UN Council on Human Rights reported in that regard, what it did not say is that the resolution establishing the Commission of Inquiry into the third of the Israel-Gaza wars, in the resolution itself, made 18 separate references to Israeli criminality. Not one reference to Hamas. And I won't speak also about my colleague William Schabis, who initially was appointed chair of that commission until he had to resign when it was discovered that he in fact had acted on behalf of the PLO and the like, or had referred to Israel itself as having engaged in criminal acts and so on prior to having become the chair of this commission. But let me just give you one example, and I'll close this third case study of the laundering on the universal public values of my own experience in this regard. And this occurred in the year 2006 when the then United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights, Louise Arbour, former colleague of mine at Osgoode Hall Law School, went on to become a member of the Canadian Supreme Court. I presided at the ceremony in which she took leave of the court to become the UN Commissioner on Human Rights. And she called me and she said, Erwin, we are setting up a commission of inquiry to look into the killings of the Palestinians in Bet Hanun, which is in northern Gaza. And we'd like you to be a member of it. Bishop Tutu will be one member, and we'd like you to be the second member. I said, is this commission of inquiry going to visit Sderot in southern Israel? So she said, no. Well, why would it go to Sderot? I said, well, it's because of the firing of rockets from northern Gaza into Sderot that Israel, in responding to those attacks, tragically, an artillery shell went astray and 18 Palestinians were killed. I said, no, we won't, but you can be part of this commission and you can make your representations and the like. I said, Louise, have you read the resolution establishing this commission of inquiry that you're asking me to join? It says, and I quoted from it, that Israel willingly murdered 18 Palestinians in Bet Hanun. So I said to her, what is there to investigate? You've already predetermined the outcome. I said, I'm sorry, I'm not prepared to become a fig leaf for the United Nations. I'm certainly not prepared to become a Jewish fig leaf for the United Nations in its continuation of this Alice in Wonderland sequence and inversion. Which brings me to the final case study of this laundering, and that is laundering under the struggle against racism. Let's face it, one of the worst things you can say about any individual or group, let alone state, is to call them a racist. The very label tends to supply the indictment. And if any further proof is required, then what you do, as in the case of Israel, you say it is not only a racist state, but an apartheid state. Now let's appreciate the word apartheid was not chosen randomly. Apartheid is defined in international law as a crime against humanity. If you say Israel is an apartheid state, then you're saying it's a crime against humanity. If it's a crime against humanity, it has no right to be. And if that is not enough, you call it also a Nazi state. So not only does it have no right to be, but we in effect have a responsibility to see that it has no right to be. Which brings me to the final part of my remarks, and that is some considerations for advocacy and action. The first is, if we frame the issue, read the delegitimization or the laundering of anti-Semitism, as simply being something prejudicial to Israel and the Jewish people, then many people will say, well, you know, we should delegitimize Israel. We should be delegitimizing them for all the reasons, as you know, that are stated in the various indictments. What has to be done if we want to frame it in a way that may begin to resonate and hopefully elicit some responsiveness of understanding is to say that what happens in the laundering of delegitimization and anti-Semitism under the four universal values, as I shared with you, is that it ends up eroding the integrity of the United Nations, under whose protective cover it is being laundered. It diminishes the authority of international law that is invoked in its defense. It corrupts the culture of human rights, and it shames the real struggle against the real racism and against the real apartheid. Because if you say that Israel was like apartheid South Africa, that means apartheid South Africa was like Israel. That means it had a universal franchise, an independent judiciary, a free press, and the like. And when I was in South Africa, and I was asked at the University with Witwatersrand about Israel as an apartheid state, my answer to them, without going to it, but at the end was, if I were you, I would be embarrassed to have that comparison made, because it shames and demeans the real struggle that you've engaged in against the real apartheid. Israel, like any other democracy, may have its faults and its inadequacies, and they should not be overlooked, and like any other democracy, needs to be critiqued. But to compare it to an apartheid South African state is to undermine the struggle against apartheid and to mischaracterize what democracies are all about. The second thing is, I think we need to take initiatives with regard to the reform of the United Nations. Instead of sometimes imbibing, as some might, that old notion of shmum, or, oh, I don't want to have anything to do with the United Nations is there. It's a reality. It also does a lot of good work in some areas in the environment and healthcare and the like. But the point is, we have, I think, a responsibility not just to lament the singling out of a member state for differential and discriminatory indictment, but to hold the UN to account for it as being a standing breach of its own laws, charters, and the like, and seek to reform it. There is no reason why at every meeting of the UN Human Rights Council, as it is taking place, as we now meet, there is a specific agenda item, even before the discussion begins, that singles out one member state for indictment before the discussion begins. Because what you have is an agenda item which says violations by Israel of the human rights of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories, and then another agenda item which is violations of human rights in the rest of the world. So you have one country-specific indictment agenda item even before the hearing begins. The very least we can do is to seek and secure equality before the law at the UN Council. And if you say to me, well, it's not going to change, we should be making the case. It's time that we got out of the docket of the accused to which we have become too customarily intoned and become the plaintiff, the claimant, not on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people, on behalf of the UN, on behalf of equality before the law, on behalf of international due process in the international arena and the like. Third, parliamentary initiatives. Let me give you one example that can serve as a template. Mark mentioned the United Nations General Assembly informal session on anti-Semitism and the countries that got up. By the way, almost all the countries, all the representations were about what I would call traditional or classical anti-Semitism. If you remember, it didn't go into the metrics of the new anti-Semitism, other than my colleague Robert Wistrich, who was there as an expert witness, and myself, who gave a brilliant speech on the new anti-Semitism. But the point is that at the end of that session, it almost went unnoticed, where they sort of said to people, go back to your parliaments and organize hearings on this. Well, I went back to Canada, and we organized what's called a take-note debate, which in traditional Canadian understatement means, in a parliamentary context, an urgent discussion on a matter of urgent moment. We had that discussion, went on for 5 hours, all parties participated. The next day I proposed, and the House of Commons unanimously adopted the following resolution. I say unanimously, and it's important, because when the Speaker of the House of Commons says, when you propose the motion and seek unanimous consent, as I did in the, is there anyone who objects to this resolution? You just need one member from 308 that gets up and says, I object, the resolution can't pass. It might pass, but can't pass unanimously. And so it has to go through a different procedure. This resolution was unanimously adopted. And I want to tell you very quickly the three components of that resolution, because I think it can serve as a template. I know, as I said to somebody, the story by the WAG, Canada, cancelled for lack of interest. I know people don't know what happens in Canada, but this is an important precedent and template. And the resolution, number one, expressed alarm at the growing international globalizing anti-Semitism. Two, called upon the Canadian government and the Canadian Parliament to make the combating of anti-Semitism a priority both domestically and internationally. And three, it excerpted from the Ottawa Protocol of Anti-Semitism a particular statement which said as follows: criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic, and saying so is wrong. But singling Israel out for selective opprobrium and indictment, denying Israel's right to exist, if not calling for Israel's destruction, is hateful and discriminatory, and not saying so is dishonest. You have here a resolution passed unanimously by the Canadian Parliament that can be used as a template, and which drew upon the Ottawa Protocol for the combating of anti-Semitism and incorporated it by reference for validation purposes. Let me just ask, how many people here, I was going to say have read, how many people here have heard of the Ottawa Protocol to combat anti-Semitism? Well, maybe 3-4 people. And this is an informed audience. And that goes back to what I say about the WAG, the Canada cancelled for lack of interest. I commend to you the reading of the Ottawa Protocol to combat anti-Semitism and its predecessor, London Declaration, both of whom were adopted in interparliamentary conferences to combat anti-Semitism, where Ira and myself are leaving to the next one in Berlin, because they can serve as templates, not just for defining anti-Semitism, but for taking action against it. Let me say a word about BDS. I wasn't going to, but in the light of the discussion this morning, and also because this Friday night we had 30 students at McGill who had just been through the BDS debate at McGill, which had two phases. In the first vote, in fact, the BDS was adopted. By the way, I understand that people weren't sure what BDS was. It's boycott, divestment, sanctions. It's essentially a kind of replication of the formula that was used against South Africa, and indeed grew out of the Durban Conference in South Africa in 2001, which was intended to be a world conference against racism. And I went there initially because that was its purpose, but which ended up being a world conference against Israel and the Jewish people. And let me just tell you one particular image and mantra that comes to my mind's eye as I mentioned Durban. Almost every day in the streets of Durban, marches took place with the following chant: that the struggle against apartheid in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against apartheid in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. That gave birth to the BDS movement in all its configurations. But what the students were saying to me, that what made it so difficult now on campus, and in terms of strategically advocating against it, is that it's gone beyond that. It's where Jewish students are themselves held out to be sort of surrogates of the white privileged class. And there's a principle which you may not have heard of, which underpins not only BDS, but the advocacy of BDS, and it's called intersectionality. And that's the idea of the campus culture, but even beyond, as being an intersection of different identities. And the BDS movement as being the intersection of all the oppressed identities, of all the oppressed minorities, of all the oppressed women and the like, and the Jewish students as being, in effect, agents of the oppressor. So it goes beyond Israel. And what they said to me, it's not that we don't know the case against BDS. We know it. It's that we are not seen as having standing to make the case. It's that we are not seen as being legitimate interlocutors in a discussion or debate where we are part of the oppressors against the oppressed, which is all those associated with the BDS movement. And I want to also state here what Debbie Litzstadt said, because I think parenthetically it's important. It's true that the origins and antecedents of the BDS movement, as I indicated at Durban and elsewhere, were anti-Jewish. But not everybody that is part of that movement is anti-Jewish. And if you seek to do that, you may thereby tar people who are there not because they believe in any anti-Jewish ethos, but because they see themselves as part of the oppressed in whatever appropriation culturally that means, and they see also Israel and the Jews as being part of the oppressors in whatever appropriation that means, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have an anti-Semitic ethos. So we have to, in terms of combating BDS, basically do two things. Again, as I said with regard to delegitimation, don't go into it as being only anti-Israel and anti-Jewish and the like. The BDS is fundamentally prejudicial to peace, prejudicial to Palestinians, prejudicial to human rights, prejudicial to canons of equality. I can go on. And that, at the end of the day, they are prejudicial to the real struggles against the real oppressions. And that is the way we have to do it, and where Jewish students, as I said to them at my house Friday night, they have to join and seek, as difficult as it is, to make coalitions with all those who are in effect right now arraigned against others, invert the Rainbow Coalition, become part of it rather than be targets of it. Let me just close with basically two more points, and very quick. On the matter of state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide, as I said, this is a standing violation of the Genocide Convention. There are juridical remedies to combat it. These are not simply policy options. In my view, they are juridical obligations. Time does not permit to go into it, but I regret that while this state-sanctioned hate to incitement to hate and genocide has been going on in the case of Khamenei's Iran, for some 16 years, not longer, not one state party to the Genocide Convention has initiated any interstate complaint against Iran for its violations of the Genocide Convention and other international treaties. But let me close with one thing when I said, and probably some of you might still remember something I said at the beginning that I'm going to close maybe with some hope. They'll say, is this guy crazy? In everything he said, he expects us to feel that there's some hope at the end of this dark tunnel. But let me just share with you an exchange I had, and you may see what I mean. When I was appointed Minister of Justice, unexpectedly, the day that I was appointed, a group of Aboriginal law students, Indigenous law students, which term you want to use, happened to have been in Ottawa, and they called and asked if they could meet with me. And I met with them, and therefore my first meeting as Minister of Justice was with these Aboriginal students. And we met, and they said as follows to me. They said, Professor Collar, we're not just law students. We're Aboriginal law students. We come with a past, with a history, with our own culture, with our own spirituality, with our own land, with our own indigenous legal systems. And we've been dispossessed of all that. We've been dislocated from our history and our heritage and our spirituality and our languages and our land and our legal systems. It's not that we go to court because we want to nurture a grievance. We go to court to reconnect to who we are. We go to court to reaffirm our Aboriginal identity. We go to court to give expression to our Aboriginal legal system. But in everything that we do, we have a great sense of pain, because we feel that the Canadian government and the Canadian people don't understand who we are, where we've come from, and what we aspire to be. So I told them that I would share with them a parable that comes out of my own heritage. I said, it's where, but I said, you can find it in other traditions. It's where the students come to their rabbi, and they say, Rabbi, we love you. And the rabbi says, do you know what hurts me? And the students say, Rabbi, why do you ask if we know what hurts you if we tell you we love you? And the rabbi says, because if you don't know what hurts me, you can't tell me you love me. Now that's a profound principle of human relationships. But as I said to them, we will try as a government in concert with you as best we can to understand that pain and those aspirations that you have. And then I said, at the risk of being pretentious or sounding presumptuous, I said, I'm also a member of an Aboriginal people. I said, a people that still inhabits the same land, embraces the same religion, studies the same Aboriginal Torah, speaks the same Aboriginal language, Hebrew, hearkens to the same Aboriginal prophets, and bears the same Aboriginal name, Israel, as we did 3,500 years ago. Whereupon, sitting with them around, someone came up to me and they said, you know, we thought this was going to be another blah blah lecture by another white man. Welcome one Aboriginal people to another. Now, I should tell you that I shared that story afterwards. It was, as I said, my first encounter as a Minister of Justice with any group. And while I was Minister of Justice, framed the notion of the Jewish people as an Aboriginal people in many of the encounters. Because I wanted to do also for the Jewish people what they were telling me with regard to the Aboriginal, to reframe in the psyche of the Canadian consciousness, you know, our roots and our values and the like. Because that's the best antidote to BDS and the like. And so I conclude with this, that a community like us here, but any community in the diaspora, people, the Jewish people, a state of Israel that has Shulton HaChok, the rule of law, as our heritage, that has Torhar HaNeshek, the purity of arms, as our doctrine in international humanitarian law, that has Tzedek Tzedek Tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue, as our abiding moral juridical injunction, if you will, that has Shalom Shalom Larachok Lakarov, peace, peace to those who are far and to those who are near, as our abiding hope and dream. Of that community, sitting here in New Jersey or anywhere else in the diaspora, of that Jewish people, of that state of Israel, after 4,000 years, we can say, Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker, that at the end of the day, truth and justice will prevail.
The point that you pointed out about the Iranians and their incitement, if they were brought to court, And assuming the court were to find them guilty, how would that be enforced?
Number one, I don't know if the court would find them guilty. I just think that the dynamics of the process of initiating the interstate complaint in and of itself would be important. It's, as I said, getting out of the docket as the target, as the accused, and becoming the plaintiff, becoming the claimant. Number two, we would at least be seeing ourselves as upholding international law, upholding the Genocide Convention against the worst of its violators. One of the things that disconcerted me with regard to the negotiation by the P5+1 of the nuclear agreement is that during the 2 years of that negotiation, while emphasis was placed understandably and necessarily on the nuclear threat, it ignored the other fourfold Iranian threats, and those being Iran as the leading state sponsor of international terrorism, Iran as a leader with regards to hegemonic aggression and belligerency in the Middle East and beyond, Iran as a state-sanctioned inciter of hate and genocide, and the worst thing which got overshadowed and utterly sanitized in those last 2 years plus, the massive domestic repression in Iran. When I'm talking about the taking up initiatives regarding the state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide by Khamenei's Iran, number one, it's to distinguish the leaders from the people, because the second part of it is to stand in solidarity with the people. And I'll just close on this point. We have in Canada, we've had for 4 years now, an Iran Accountability Week, which actually runs 2 weeks, in which we go into the five-fold Iranian threats. And we emphasize in particular amongst them the massive domestic repression. We have to make common cause with the Iranian people who are seeking for us to stand in solidarity with them and not focus only on the nuclear threat, but focus on the other threats.
In 2005, at the ISGAP conference at Yale, Ruth Weiss charged us to become plaintiffs against global anti-Semitism. And I thought that surely by now there would have been more cases of suits against global anti-Semitism wherever they appear. But there have been so few, if any. And can you explain that?
Well, because part of the problem is that, I hate to say it, but I'll say this as somebody who was a member of a government and who interacted with other governments. There's a lot of government leaders that really don't know their own case and don't know the international legal remedies that may be available. And there's also because political considerations come in and sometimes override it, or economic considerations come in and sometimes override it. I can cite chapter and verse on this. But I think it's our both responsibility and capacity to try to mobilize these coalitions, governmental, parliamentary, legal, civil society. And I'll close with this thing. Recently, I launched a Raoul Wallenberg Center for International Human Rights, named in honor of not only our first Canadian citizen, Raoul Wallenberg, but an honorary citizen of the United States and of Israel and Australia, as well as a citizen of Sweden. It's a coalition, an international coalition of parliamentarians, scholars, jurists, human rights defenders, NGOs, and students, united in the pursuit of justice, inspired by and anchored in Raoul Wallenberg's humanitarian legacy. One of our first acts was to establish in the Canadian Parliament an all-party, because we don't want these things to be partisan, an all-party parliamentary Raoul Wallenberg Parliamentary Caucus for Human Rights. One of its objectives, though not the only one, is combating anti-Semitism. But it's combating anti-Semitism as part of a larger spectrum of human rights pursuits and as part of a larger pursuit of justice. So we become part of a larger coalition in that regard. And one of our objectives is also defending political prisoners, because the political prisoners, and some of whom I've been representing, like Raif Badawi in Saudi Arabia or Leopoldo Lopez in Venezuela, or some Iranians and the like, they are themselves targets and people who've been imprisoned by their repressive governments. If on the campuses we want to serve as an antidote with regard to this intersectionality, we say, okay, you want to stand up for the oppressed people? Here are a series of political prisoners. We want you to stand in their behalf. And so we are seeking to organize on different campuses now that they take up the case and cause of a political prisoner. So I believe there is work to be done. I believe we can do it, and let's hope that this meeting today becomes part of that, not only bearing witness, but advocacy and action. Thanks.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.